Hi, my name's Tim Judson. I'm lecturer in ministerial formation at Regent's Park College in Oxford, and I became introduced to Common Awards when I studied for ministry myself in Bristol, where I did the master's course for Common Awards there. I was a pastor of a church until just this Christmas, just gone, but was finding straddling pastor and teaching in theological college was just like way too much. So I'm now just teaching in Oxford whilst living in Devon, which rhymes with heaven, and there's a good reason for that. So yeah, I mean, as a pastor, I've always found that community is a lot richer if you have people who are very different, rubbing shoulders with one another, learning from one another if they're willing to. And I think that goes just as much, if not more, for people of a global majority heritage. So in our country, where often we're in just white churches in white areas, actually there's so much depth and insight and a far richer understanding of Christian faith that comes from engaging with people who bring other cultures, other emphases when they read the scriptures, and just foregrounding things that otherwise we as white communities wouldn't be able to pick up or wouldn't notice naturally. I was in my second year at Bristol Baptist College where I had a tutor who had a really formative impact on me, Anthony Reddy, who's now Professor Anthony Reddy of Oxford University. And he just opened the Christian faith to me in a way that really challenged a lot of my presumptions, particularly my passion for justice. I've always been really passionate about issues of justice. And I realized that in my kind of zeal for things to be good and right and true, kind of, seeing God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, often there are these blind spots and these presumed senses of agency that I carry, which are actually very privileged and very white. And Anthony Reddy was really formative at challenging a lot of those things in me. And to be honest as well, I think actually he made me realize that there's this thing within inside me that just has this natural disposition to think that I'm like maybe smarter than a lot of global majority people, which I know is wrong and I know it's sinful and I know objectively that it's not true. But I think because of the stuff I've been exposed to, the people I've been shown as exemplary Christians or as really clever people in my growing up in education, I've just been taught to think that the heroes of the world or that the kind of really smart or high achieving people are white. And actually, that's just not true. History has just been told in a certain way. And meeting Anthony Reddy, discovering one of the cleverest people I've ever met, and also meeting increasingly a number of global majority folks in the Baptist world, but also in academia, as well as around the world, people who have indigenous ways of thinking that have really challenged my worldview and made me realize the limitations actually of my kind of Western heritage that have made me think I need to interrogate that a little bit more because it's actually sometimes not better than anyone else's. In fact, sometimes there's a lot that's caused tremendous harm because of the ignorance with which people like me have acted at times. I guess if there's anyone who's maybe in a predominantly white area, they might think, oh, there isn't a problem with like race and racism here, um, which is a classic thing that people can think, but actually it's because people have never had to do the work to thinking about that sort of thing, and that perpetuates it. And there's a lot of folks who I've spoken to who would never move to Devon or to the Southwest because they feel very racialized, very treated in racial ways down in the Southwest, even though loads of people in the Southwest don't think we have a problem with racism. Um, so I think that's something to consider, that just because you might live in a predominantly white area or be part of a white worshiping community, that doesn't mean that this is therefore not a subject that pertains to you and your context. In fact, I think it highlights a very big challenge that you need to face. But also, I think one of the things I've come across has been that there's a lot of people who often say, "Oh, that author or that particular person, they don't sound like they're a kind of white Westerner, so they probably have a biased view. They probably have an agenda." You get this a lot with women authors as well, or women preachers, oh, they're a woman, so therefore, of course, they're biased. But I think that really exposes actually how ignorant we are of the fact that we all have a particular lens and a horizon with which we see things. And the idea that like a white man from the Western world doesn't have a particular emphasis, doesn't have a particular horizon, and doesn't have a social imagination that constitutes the way that they think theologically and the way that they understand relationships in the world. I just think that's just a ridiculous idea. We all have a particular horizon, we all have a lens, we all have something that we foreground and a particular point of departure. And I think one of the things that reading a lot of global majority heritage authors or listening to people who come with a particular optic that is open about their kind of contextual horizons is that actually it makes you realize that, oh gosh, I have that too. And so to say that one person might have an agenda whilst others don't, I think is a fallacious thing to say. And so anyone that might think, oh, I'm wary about reading someone who might be different, I think it's precisely the reason that you need to read someone who's different, because they might help you realize the way you have a particular lens by which you read the Bible, by which you understand church, by the way you understand what is even moral. And I think it could be really helpful for ministers, for Christians, for anyone involved in any kind of organization to think about how they do community well. So I've been asked that question quite a lot in the last year, because I've been presenting a lecture around the country in church contexts and university contexts, and that lecture's been based on a publication called Dark Weeping and Light Sleeping: Whiteness as a Doctrine of Deformation, and definitely recommend having a read of that. It's not comprehensive, but it tries to tease out some of the ways in which we live and move and have our being in a way that is universalizing white Western norms in a way which needs to be interrogated. But actually, you could go a lot further than that, and actually engage with some of the people who are the primary voices from whom I'm learning, actually. So I could recommend probably one of my favorite and most easy to engage with texts is a book by Anthony Reddy called Is God Colorblind?, where he really starts to unpack the way that some of these things work on a very practical level, including an interpretation of the parable of the talents, which just was mind-blowing for me in terms of how he read the biblical text really faithfully to the text, offering a very different interpretation of it to what I have understood it to be at times.